Hello! In the previous module, we looked at what physicalism about the mind might be. In this module, we're going to look at arguments for physicalism, and we'll be focused on one in particular. So we'll quickly review what physicalism about the mind says, and then we will start looking at some arguments, and we'll be focused on one argument in particular about how an argument for physicalism that says that in order to interact with the physical world, the mind itself must be physical. So let's get started. We want to remember that we have this idea of mind-brain correlations. So for example, pain and some brain state, we don't know what right now, but let's call it brain state A, are correlated. And what that means is that there are two possibilities for any given person. Either one, they are in pain and also their brain is in state A, or two, they're not in pain and also their brain is not in state A. So you have either both of them, pain in the brain state, or neither of them, neither pain nor the brain state. So their occurrence is correlated. And we call that the brain state with which a mental state is correlated the neural correlate of the mental state. So physicalism about the mind, that says that the mind can be reduced to fundamental physics, that the mind can be explained in terms of fundamental physics, and mental states themselves can be explained in terms of fundamental physics, particular mental states like pain or pleasure or love or the belief that I am 6 feet tall or any other particular mental state. So we say that what they are really mental states are just brain states, and then of course we explain what brain states are in terms of what kind of cells they are, which is explained in terms of what kind of molecules make up those cells, which is explained in terms of what atoms are in those molecules, which is then explained in terms of the fundamental atomic constituents of the brain. So we think that on this view, mental states just are brain states. When you say that someone is in pain, what you are in effect doing, although you didn't know it, is saying that they're in a particular brain state. So one possible way we might carry out this reduction is to say that the mind is an information processing machine, and we briefly remember that what that means is that what the mind does is it collects information about the world using sensory perception. It processes that information using things like memory and reasoning and imagination and so on, and then it produces action on the world that's appropriate to how it thinks the world is, how it represents the world as being. And we think that on this view, all of that information processing, it's carried out in the physical medium of the brain, and that's how we explain the brain in physical terms. We explain the mind in physical terms. We explain the brain in terms of its physical constituents, and then we explain how the brain can carry out the information processing, and once we've done that, we've explained how the brain is actually the mind, or rather how the mind is the brain. So that's the sort of way we're thinking about what physicalism says. So what are some possible reasons for physicalism? Well, you might try to argue that the mind is just and only an information processing machine. I think it's fairly plausible that part of what the mind does is process information. Is that all that the mind does? If you could establish that, then you would have an argument for physicalism. And people have tried to argue that, but that's not the approach we're taking in this module. In this course, I've tried to sort of make it plausible that, among other things, what the mind does is process information, but to argue that the mind is purely physical, you'd have to argue that that's all that the mind is just an information processing machine. You might try to argue the correlations between mind states and neural states show that physicalism is true, but there are lots of other possible explanations of those correlations, and you might try to work through them and show that physicalism is the best one. That's another possible strategy you might pursue. It's not the one we'll be looking at here. What we'll be looking at here is the ubiquitous nature of the physical world and the mind's interaction with the physical world itself. And I just want to discuss briefly this universality of physics argument because it's sort of heading in the direction that we're going to end up going in and looking at an argument for physicalism about the mind, but it's not quite it. And so it'll be helpful to look at it briefly. And then in the next videos, we'll get into the actual causal argument. So the universality argument is just this. It says that according to physics, everything is made up of particles, forces, and fields. Well, if everything is made up of those, then minds and mental states will be made up of particles, forces, and fields, and that would mean that minds and mental states are physical. Well, this is a valid argument, but it's not so clear that the first premise is true. What is certainly the case is that according to physics, everything physical is made up of particles, forces, and fields. But it's not obvious that physics tells us that literally everything is made up of particles, forces, and fields. In fact, that just begs the question to that first, the P there, which is the one that the argument needs. P star is fine. It's totally true. According to physics, yes, everything is made up of everything physical. Everything physical is made up of particles, forces, and fields. The question is everything made up of particles, forces, and fields, which would be to say that everything is physical, but that's just what's in question. We're wondering, is everything physical? And in particular, is the mind physical? And if it is, then we would say, yes, well, then physics tells us that it's made up of particles and forces and fields. But if it's not physical, then physics wouldn't tell us what it's made up of. So the question is, in fact, is everything made up of particles, forces, and fields, and in particular, is the mind? And this argument just assumes that the answer to that question is yes, but that's what we're worrying about. So that argument is not going to work, so we're going to need to look at a somewhat more involved argument, and we will get going with that argument in the next video.